Welcome to the Beyond Body podcast with your hosts, Mia and Holly. Join us for a sometimes fortnightly podcast
where we explore all things mental health, being a messy human, and how to get the most out of this one precious life.
and all the ridiculous stories in between. Welcome back, everybody. Just jumping in with a gentle trigger warning. We're going to be discussing the topics of grief and loss in this episode, and as part of that discussion, we also touch on suicide. So if it doesn't feel like a safe or appropriate time to engage with this episode, please do not feel any pressure to continue listening and perhaps come back to it at a later time. Good morning, Holly. Welcome back to another week. Tell us where on your adventures we find you this time.
Buongiorno to you. I'm in Italy. I think this location I'm in now, this tiny town called Cefalù in Sicily. It's my favorite location. I've been on the trip thus far. But since we last spoke, I was in Paris, I think, when we last spoke, and then I spent 6 days on this super interesting, super tiny remote island. It was actually like the most challenging experience I've had in a really long time.
Wow.
It was beautiful. So this island, 100, it has 100 residents. It's like only 5 kilometers, like that's the circumference of it. No
Wow.
cars, no roads, no hotels. There's like a handful of very small Airbnbs. It's in the blue zone. So like people live to be really old there.
Wow.
And what I didn't realize going in August in Italy, like the place I was staying was like so simple, which I love, but like no cooling, and it didn't get below 30 degrees at night.
Oh,
So I think I spent the whole
terrible.
time, my body was just trying to regulate, regulate its temperature the whole time. But there was like a donkey had to bring up my suitcase, and like it was just so cool. I felt like it was like 100, like I was like in 1900. The toilet was a good 10-minute walk away. It was like just a little like camping stove, but it was the most peaceful place I think I have ever been, with this just like navy blue blanket of stars. Because in Europe, there's not many places you get to see like the whole vastness of stars. So I think it really, even though I felt like I'm literally on the other side of the world from home, it felt like home because Byron just has such a beautiful like collection of stars every night. So yeah, it was special but difficult. So I'm now super stoked to be sitting in aircon in my cute Nonna kitchen.
Yeah, you're so right. Like Europe, I always get like a quite claustrophobic feeling when I've been there for a while because it doesn't have that expansive feeling. It can feel a little bit walled in sometimes. So that's incredibly special to get that sense of like peace and calm and just tranquility is quite hard to come across over there.
Yeah, it was so like I just hadn't had silence for such a long time, like complete silence. And then I tried to really embrace it. I was like, I don't need to listen to music. Like I can actually just be in the complete hot, humid silence.
Yeah.
So it was an experience, but it was beautiful.
Gorgeous. Love it. I saw your stories. Your stories looked like a 60s movie in Europe. You know what I mean? Like some really cool, gorgeous, sort of it just captured the scenery, but you just have such a gift for it. I'm telling you. I know you don't love the social media stuff, but you can tell a story so easily through like the imagery that you choose and the music that you choose. You really tell stories really beautifully.
Thanks, Mel. Maybe if I'm not a recovery coach in the future, I'll be a content creator. No, I wouldn't. I wouldn't do it.
Absolutely not.
I'm not quitting my job.
You would have
Absolutely
1,000 jobs before you would happily do that. I know that's for sure.
Definitely not doing that. So what's been happening with you, Mel? And what are we talking about today?
We are going to be diving into a little bit of a deeper topic today, which is all about grief, which funny you should sort of mesh those questions because the last month for me is a really mixed bag of emotions. So it's my dad's anniversary of his passing every August, but it's also my recovery anniversary in that month. And so I tend to, like, I've had the most amazing, beautiful experiences with especially girlfriends and friendship recently. Like I caught up with a girlfriend from high school recently, and we just spent like 8 or 9 hours together, just reminiscing and just in, just when you meet up with somebody and you're both just in sync, needing the same thing from each other. Do you know what I mean? Just like re-anchoring ourselves and she's going through some stuff. I was obviously going through some stuff with that mixed bag of emotions. So it's been a really beautiful time, but it's also a very heavy time emotionally. And I said to you that we've bounced around the concept of maybe talking about grief and talking about loss before. And I said to you, I'm actually quite ready to have this conversation, not about, necessarily the specifics of my experience, but more my experiences of grief, because they have been very up and down, and I have learned a lot from it. And I know that when I was navigating grief and loss, I had no idea what was going on, what to do, how to cope, where to go, what was happening to me internally, what was happening to my sense of the world. So I just thought that it would be something that would be helpful for us to chat about, because nobody's getting out of this life thing without this awful experience. And I think it's also a lesson about, how recovery can be helpful in
Mm.
ways that go beyond just the eating disorder experience, because what I learned in my recovery were enormous benefits to me in terms of navigating this whole grief process. That is very long-winded, but double barrel question, double barrel answer. How are you feeling about going into today's episode with a little bit of a heavier topic?
I think this topic is really, really important to talk about because we don't talk about it that much. And particularly in the recovery space, it's definitely not something that's really spoken about. Of course, I want to come into this conversation with so much sensitivity for your feelings and my feelings, and also just for our listeners. Death is hard to talk about, grief is hard to talk about, but you're right. Like we're both life and death, like it's part of the deal.
Yeah.
And I think what, recovery is very much about, but also what the podcast is about is just we're trying to do our best to embrace all parts of life, and like the easier and the lighter ones, but also the more difficult but really important ones. So I'm feeling ready to come into this conversation is what I would say.
Yeah, absolutely. And we just, holding space for each other, holding space for our listeners. And if this is something that you can listen to or listen to in parts, or maybe you need to come back to later, it will always be here for you. In the first 6 months, something like this may not have felt ready, like I may not have felt ready for it, but it is nice to know that, it may be here at a time when you need it. So, Hol, for
Yeah.
you,
Yeah.
obviously, we have concepts of grief and loss. We see how it's depicted. We hear other people talk about it. We watch other people go through it. What was some of your understandings of what it's like to experience grief and loss before you went through your own experiences, where it might have been a bit closer to home, versus, you actually experiencing it for yourself versus the outside looking in perspective?
Mm. My understanding of grief before I experienced it was complete naivety.
Mm.
I think we're so funny as humans, just like walking around expecting that everything is just going to stay as it is, as if loss like wasn't part of what it means to be a human being, which, is so outrageous because the truth of life is that there's going to be a lot of pain in it and maybe more loss and grief that we actually want to believe. And I think how we make peace with that, like that's what this journey is about, that we're figuring it out. And I mean, until I experienced grief, I wasn't yet trying to figure that out. We all like know in theory that grief is part of life, and yet it just still comes as such a shock when our hearts are broken into a million pieces.
Yeah.
So I had honestly had no intimate concept of grief before it happened to me. I also think when I first experienced grief as well, I was young, like I was 20 years old, and it was actually before my recovery. I'm very confident to say now, if I had experienced grief for the first time after my recovery, it would have been a completely different experience because, of course, my recovery gave me the core coping skills to deal with the bigger things in life. I didn't have those skills before I experienced grief, which I think made it a lot more of a complex experience for me than it probably had to be.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's one of those things that, everyone can explain it. It can be described to you. Someone can give you the forensic details of what it's going to feel like, and it's still going to come as a shock how specific these feelings are, and obviously how specific they are to you. I think it's really interesting because Josie and I were both having these very polar opposite experiences at the same time. She had given birth to Nina just as I left to go and take care of Dad just before he died. And so Nina was newborn when Dad passed away, just, weeks later. So she was experiencing this immense life event that no one can describe or explain, where, women will often say, and parents, fathers, whoever will say, I just had no idea how it was actually going to feel, or, maybe the immense love that, people can feel when that event happens, just that immediate rush of feelings. I think it's the same thing with death. There's no level of uh, deep description or specific explanation that can make you feel ready or give you an understanding of how it's going to impact you. And I think I
Mm,
thought that it was just one universal expression or experience
mm,
of grief, that everyone felt grief in the same way, to the same extent, they had the same reactions. And what I've learned is one of the things that makes it so complex in terms of talking about it is that not everything's going to resonate because it is so specific to you as a person. It's so specific to who that person was to you, your specific relationship to them. Like for me, in the deaths that I've had that are close to me, everyone's had a different reaction, and that can actually cause more disconnection than unity. It can cause, all of these issues that, we think maybe of grief as a unifying thing and everyone coming together and everyone having the same experience. And one of the biggest takeaways I had when I went through it is just how unique and specific it is for every single person, even within their own family unit or friendship unit or whoever the people are that you're sharing this loss with. Everyone's going to have their own unique journey in and out of it.
mm. I think in that sense as well, I would sort of compare grief and love are very similar in the sense that no one experiences them the same way. And it is also going to be so case dependent is the wrong word, but so dependent on like that interpersonal relationship and like what you mean to each other and how that feels and what it looks like and how it changes over time. I also think I sort of see like grief and love, I guess, having so many shared qualities. The biggest one being that you don't choose either of them,
Yeah.
but you have to go through both of them.
Yes. Yeah. And the only way to prevent that kind of, event in your life or feeling in your life is
Mm.
to be completely disconnected and isolated from the world, which is another grief entirely unto itself in terms of, those avoidant things where we're like, well, if I don't want to go through it, then you can't lose something you never had. You know what I mean? But this is kind of the
Mm.
price of being in your life and experiencing love and experiencing connection. And I, saw something so fantastic the other day. It was, I think, I don't know if he was a sociologist or anthropologist. I'm not sure. He was being interviewed and he said, the most insane, he may have actually been a divorce lawyer, actually. Same thing though. I think they're sociologists in some way.
Listening to.
He said, the most insane thing anybody ever does is love a pet, love a parent, love a partner, love a friend,
Mm.
because there is inherent loss, whatever the outcome is, whether or not it is death or it's divorce or it's, just growing apart from each other. It's all going to end in loss, all of it. So it's one of the most courageous, brave, beautiful things we do, but it is the price of entry to having some of
Mm.
the most profound and beautiful experiences that you're going to have, which is usually the ones you have with others. That's the risk that you take, which is both beautiful, but it can be obviously some of the darkest periods of your life as well. It's that inevitability. It's that intersection of those two things are a part of the same whole.
Oh, absolutely. Because, I also think grief comes in so many different forms, just as loss comes in so many different forms. And you're so right. It's kind of part of the package to be brave and say yes to opening yourself up to living a full life. And that means to love people. You also open yourself up to the imminent loss of losing those people and the heartbreak of that. And the option is either getting both of them or getting none of them.
Yes.
So I
Yeah.
think, most people would probably be like, let's do this. Let's put ourselves out there. Let's be open. Let's open our hearts to love and inevitably losing that love.
Yes. I think one of the other things that I really learned that I never had a concept of before was all the different ways it manifests that, I certainly didn't have language for at the time. Things like anticipatory grief, watching someone who's passing away versus finding out that somebody has passed away
Yeah.
without any prior knowledge that that was going to happen. And how, again, it's so
Mm.
specific to the individual, because I will often have people, when I describe, the fact that dad died of cancer and that I was able to move to America and take care of him, they'll say, aren't you so lucky that you knew you had that time together? And I just want to,
Wow.
for both of our sakes, just turn on my heel and
Yeah.
walk away from that conversation, because there is no better way to lose someone. There is no softening of the blow of grief or loss. There are
Yeah.
different traumas that come with all kinds of expressions of grief and that are caused by
Mm.
all different kinds of events of loss. So, yeah, all of these different experiences that are just incredibly complicated. And one of the things that I think needs to be highlighted and that people don't recognize enough is the intersection of grief and trauma, where I thought for years that what I was dealing with was grief, where it actually ended up being intertwined with trauma because of the way that dad died. And I see that so much
Okay.
now. When I hear that somebody has lost someone, I will always send that up as a bit of a thing for them to flag. You know, if you have a friend who's lost someone, just keep an eye out for some of these signs or symptoms that there might be some trauma in there as well, because too often people are told it'll just be a matter of time and, you know, you'll learn to deal with it. And that's all true of grief. It is not true of trauma. If there is trauma that is
Yeah.
sort of piggybacking on that grief, it can actually make the grieving process uh, longer and impossible to access until that trauma has been worked through. Um, so yeah, I just think that there's so many complexities to this that don't get talked about, and then people don't have the opportunity to maybe
Yeah.
not make the process easier, but maybe get support they need, or to be
Mm.
able to put it into context as far as what's
Mm.
happening to them.
I find that so interesting because like I had, no understanding of that. I think like I'm curious, I'm sure listeners are probably also curious, like what are some of those like signs or things that maybe people should look at that there is that bond between trauma and grief?
Great question. So I was going to therapists repeatedly. I tried two or three different ones and they were CBT, and none of them identified that what I was dealing with was trauma. So they were just trying to do talk therapy with me. And I would just shut down. Like I just couldn't. They tried to get me to talk
Yeah.
about how he died and how I felt about it. And I felt a lot of responsibility for how dad died. That's trauma speaking. But I now know I wasn't. But I couldn't go there because it was just, it was like I was back there emotionally, physically. I would have, you know, all of the PTSD symptoms of flashbacks and all that sort of stuff. So some of the things that started to manifest for me that were the most debilitating were I started to become incredibly anxious, incredibly hypervigilant. I was staying with my mum when I got back from America after he died, and I implemented a rule that she had to give me like hours notice before anybody came by, because I just couldn't handle someone knocking on the door, or as happens in country towns, just someone opening the back door and coming in. I just couldn't have unexpected surprises. I was so on a knife's edge emotionally at all times. I'm somebody who's pretty capable of really detecting what I'm feeling, and I'm pretty emotionally in tune with myself. I couldn't have named any of the feelings that I was experiencing. I just felt like I was in a gray, just fog at all times, and that even my connection to myself had been interrupted and, you know, thrown off course. I was unable to actually grieve. Like I couldn't cry. I couldn't talk about him. I couldn't celebrate him. When I would think of him, I would only think of him in that specific scenario of how he died. I couldn't recall how he was before that or any positive memories about him. Um, and I just was not coping. I couldn't sleep. There were periods where I was given medication to be able to sleep, and it didn't matter what dosage I took, I couldn't sleep. I was just on edge and just at a 10 and in fight or flight mode constantly. And all of this, but via my therapist, I was told that is all just grief. That is just part of the process, and it wasn't. So there were 2 or 3 years there where I was just my mental health was deteriorating, and this was escalating until finally a fantastic GP on the South Coast referred me to a trauma therapist. And when I did EMDR, I could finally separate out here's the trauma and here's the grief. And finally, 2 or 3 years later, I could grieve my father. I could cry about it. I could
Wow.
think of
Wow.
him. I could celebrate him. I could watch videos of him. I recorded all of our Skype conversations before he died. Um,
Mm.
like I could actually interact with the loss. Whereas before it was like the trauma was an enormous wall of fire, like a ring of fire around my grief, and I just
Wow.
couldn't get access to it. But all that time, I was told I was grieving, where actually I was just like swimming in trauma.
Wow, Mel, what an experience that you've been through. I also just, yeah, I mean, I just want to hold so much space for your experience because it is immense and it's been such a journey. And I think even being able to get to this point where you can talk about this and help other people understand that, like, this is what grief potentially can look like when it's a little bit more complex than that. Because, if this is also everyone has to have a first experience of grief.
Yes.
It's like you don't get to prepare for it. Like you don't, like you can a little bit, but not really. I don't think you can prepare for it at all.
Mm.
So I think it's really this experience of like get in there and figure out how to swim, and that's what you've had to do here. And I think it is just I have so much respect for you, and you are just so brave and courageous to be able to get through this experience. I also know that, when we first started working together and you were my coach, you were very much in this process. And
Yeah.
I think to be able to hold space for someone else's darkest hour when you were in your darkest hour,
Mm.
it takes a lot.
Mm. Yeah. It's a
So
life
I'm very
raft.
grateful for that.
Oh, thank you, Hol. That's beautiful.
Mm,
It was a life raft for me. Like that was the business, and like what I could do for others was like my flotation device. Because
mm,
that's the other thing it does to you. And I think this is another huge warning sign. Grief can certainly do this, but trauma, I did not realize. And I work in mental health. I should have known. I mean, I'm not a therapist, so I'm not, I'm not specialized in this, but I certainly know how to identify, when there could be trauma coming up for a client so I can flag it with another mental health professional. Is that it just changes your whole sense of self and your whole sense of the world. Like it just makes you question everything. Like everything just becomes a little bit, not that you're hopeless and it's all darkness all the time. It's just people die. Life's pretty pointless. Who gives a shit? Like why get excited about
mm.
anything? Why you're not in the deepest depression of all time, which is why it's so insidious. It just takes all the color out of the world and takes all the like light off the horizon. Do you know what I mean? Like there's nothing to be excited about. There's nothing to look
Yeah.
forward to. And it wasn't even conscious grief of like, because my dad's not here and I don't get to celebrate it. It wasn't that. It was just symptomatic. It just felt physical and visceral.
Mm,
And my sense of self as well. Like I didn't trust myself. I didn't trust myself to make decisions. I didn't trust myself, like in terms of like personally for me, I didn't trust, um, I didn't feel like I had this solid anchor of myself and the foundation of myself that I built during recovery and like worked so hard for. It was still
mm,
in there, but I was disconnected from it because trauma is just such a sever. It just cuts through all those ties to like your true self and to other people as well. Because obviously you become very hyper vigilant about losing other people. And I kept reporting all of this stuff to my doctors, to my therapist, and they were like, it's grief. You just got to give it time. And I was like, this is getting worse. Like I can't, if this is what grief is, it doesn't seem to be what other people are experiencing, by the majority.
mm,
Now that I've experienced it, I see it everywhere. You can see the look in someone's eyes
mm,
when they've dropped down from grief into trauma, um, and where they just can't move past it, right? So yeah, it was the business and my work and like that sense of who I am. I have so much confidence in that and so much like that's so much an anchor. Like I know that part of me. The grief and trauma part of me was just like eroding. So yeah, it was a lifeline. But if I kept going like that, I don't know that I would have been able to like manage my
mm.
life for much longer, to be perfectly honest. Like it was really the only thing that I could
Yeah.
do was work.
Wow, Mil. Your story is just so incredibly brave. I think, the loss of a parent it's my greatest fear in life. Like it actually keeps me up at night. And I can in no way understand your grief, but I can very much try to be empathetic towards it through understanding my own experiences of it.
Yeah.
Um, because it's such a tricky, complex thing. And it's so nice sort of hearing how like your evolution of it and really being able to um like you just really had to advocate for yourself and figure out what was actually going on here. And it sounds like, you just didn't give up on yourself because you knew this is not how I'm supposed to live, because you probably now did have this framework of this is how I can show up in the world. This is how I can feel in the world. That recovery really gives you that sort of anchor. So it's almost like you drifted away from that a little bit, but you knew how to come back to it.
Yeah.
I think my experience of grief was different because I didn't yet have that anchor.
Mm.
So I was just drifting,
Yeah.
didn't know where I was going.
Paddling
Um,
around.
and I was just paddling around, trying to figure it out. This is a little bit hard for me to talk about, but I'm gonna try.
Yeah.
Um, but because I think this conversation is really useful. So maybe some context that will help here is when I was 20, so like ripe, like very green young girl,
Mm.
I was in this really on-off, incredibly toxic, incredibly passionate relationship with someone that was a lot older than me.
Mm.
Um, and the relationship in itself was chaos, which in reflection was obviously very much just a bit of a mirror into my own internal world at that time. Um, because I wasn't in recovery, but I was very unwell. So I was very much in that phase of having an eating disorder where I was relying a lot on external validation, and this relationship gave that to me.
Yeah.
Um, but I think in that naivety, which was just also my age, I very much fell in love with someone who had a deep darkness to them, and I just saw the world in them. And I think, this also goes to speak of like just the empathetic nature of a lot of people who have eating disorders. I really
Yes.
wanted to just make him okay and show him that the life was beautiful. And he also made me feel like I was 10 feet tall and like I was literally capable of anything. And he sadly took his own life. And this grieving process was so complicated for me because I wasn't, even before he passed away, I wasn't seeing the relationship for what it was because I
Mm.
didn't know who I was.
Yeah.
So it made the grieving process really complicated.
Mm.
So I think for a long time, I couldn't really process it clearly. And, also for a lot of reasons, the relationship was really private because of the age and like there was just all these barriers. So I think it was then also quite hard for external people understand my pain.
Yeah.
Um, but in reflection, I obviously know the relationship was as much a form of disassociation for him as it was for me. But I actually didn't handle it. I was still, using very fiery, maladaptive ways to suppress my pain.
Yeah.
And I was just attempting to swallow the storm instead of processing it or having any desire to naturally let it flow. Um, and the way in which I coped with this grief was with my eating disorder because it was my main coping mechanism.
Yeah.
So this was very much something that, of course, triggered a negative eating disorder spiral, which took me a while to pull myself out of, but that would be the last spiral that I would ever have.
Yeah.
Because I think even though initially it was quite dark, it was also sort of this stark punch in the gut wake up call that I need to, like, mental health is the most important thing in the world, health in general. But I also need to have a serious look at how I am treating myself in relationships and the level of self-respect that I have in relationships as well.
Yeah.
So this experience of grief was like the catapult to so much experience in my life.
Mm.
But would I have liked to be a little bit more prepared for it? Yeah, probably.
Mm. I really appreciate you talking about it, especially, it's such a difficult, complicated subject to talk about in terms of people taking their lives with your experience of it. And also just, the subject matter more generally, like it is and I think that you do it beautifully, like you do with anything, like with just so much compassion and so much thought for others. And it explains so much of, I've said this to you before, like I feel really honored that I got to obviously be a part of your recovery, but I've also got to see you become and we're always becoming like all the future versions of ourselves. But I got to see you become who you are. And now as we like moved into like working together and, our friendship building, it's all of these things that we find out about each other. It's like we're backfilling to these understandings that we used to have of each other, where it's like, oh, that makes so much sense. That makes so much sense. Why, especially like I know at the retreat, when we do the values work, one of yours is beauty, which I love when you do that because it surprises people and people are like, what do you mean? What do you mean beauty is one of her values? And the way you describe it is so beautiful, which is it's the beauty in how you connect to people and in how you're present and how you appreciate every day. And you fought very, very hard for your recovery. And I think that you honor it and you appreciate it and you show gratitude for like that younger version of yourself, this one that you're talking about who went through this experience, and then the one who went through this healing process. Like you show up and you honor her every day.
Oh, thanks, Mel. That's very sweet. I think you're so right. We're kind of like putting in the pieces we didn't have before when it was just like professional relationship.
Yeah. Because I feel like
Because
my sense of you hasn't changed, but like when you just have a feeling about somebody, like my sense of you has never changed, but my knowledge of you and like my appreciation of you has obviously like expanded so intensely over that period of getting to know each other. But that anchored,
Mm.
like this is a really good chick, like feeling has like was always there through the whole thing. It's just that now we're filling in all the bits of the mosaic and it's like creating the picture.
I feel like that's the best compliment I've ever had. She's a
Ah!
really good chick. I feel like if people think about me, I'm stoked. That's
Yeah, yeah,
great. What was I just going to say? Oh, yeah. I think, we are so much made from the losses that we've had. And I think, of course, grief is it's gonna impact us and shape us mentally and emotionally and spiritually.
yeah.
I think, look, spiritually, I really feel like death is just the lesson of perspective and appreciation and depth, right? I think the deeper that you can feel a loss, the deeper that you can love as well. I think
Yeah.
those things are so, so deeply intertwined. And I think my experiences of it is that has given me so much more resilience and of course just compassion for other people and what they're experiencing. I think particularly like, my experience of it when I was in grief, I was in it. Like I'm looking at my world. This is my view.
Yeah.
But I think as time as I, was able to process and have had other experience of grief since then, it just almost reminds me of like the fragility of life and that every moment is actually just so important because you never know what's going to happen. And so I think, I mean, you would probably agree with this. The lessons of grief are endless.
Yeah. Yes. And it's so the duality of like the lenses at which you look through an experience, because it's kind of like I talk about that hypervigilance where I was so terrified of people
Mm.
dying. Because I mean, the other complication is that dad died, I came home, and then a few months later, I walked into my grandmother's house and found her dead in her house. So it was like, oh, I'm right. I'm hyper vigilant for a
Mm.
reason. Like this is just going to continue to happen. So that wasn't very helpful, even though that's still an irrational thought. It felt to that irrational part of me like this is evidence. You do need to be this vigilant. And that over time, especially as I healed the trauma that was really feeding off that, fear, that fear is still a good one to have. It's just which part of you is using it. Like, of course, it is so, especially when you've had the deep, dark, into the depths experience of grief. Of course, there is an innate fear of going back into that. But it also then, with the healthy use of that, is the gratitude and the presence that you can have with people. And also the deep gratitude and awareness that you have of the finite nature of life, which I think we all understand on some level until it's right in front of you. Like I remember after dad passed away, it's so funny. Grief is so ridiculous. Like we're sitting there crying and then we're making jokes and laughing. And then we're like playing music and like we were just sitting with him. And I just remember holding his face and just thinking, this is so, I was 31 and I'm looking, thinking, just open your eyes. Like this childish thought of like, this is so stupid. Like just open your eyes. Like you're still here. And that sat with me for so long because it was part of the trauma was using that, and now I see it in such a different way of that's kind of the magic of life, right? Like that's the mortal coil, is that you can have this body that's there and you've got all the physical and then there's the essence of this person. Because I'm not like speaking to what you were just saying as far as like what does it do to us mentally and emotionally and spiritually, and what can we make of this experience. I'm not a religious person. I'm not a spiritual person, really. I think I'm a little more spiritual now in the sense that when people say to me, do you believe there's a heaven? I'm like, I don't know that there's like the heaven that we're all told and sold. I can't say with absolute certainty now that we just don't go anywhere, because to see it in front of you, to really have the privilege of being in the room when somebody is like slipping off that last little part, that last
Wow.
little bend of the mortal coil, there is something indescribable about that, which is, where does it go?
Wow.
Where does the energy go? And I slept next to this man for the last 3 nights before he died, like right next to his bed on a mattress on the floor. Like I could feel that energy going. And where did it go?
Wow.
And that's not me clinging to this, I'm not in any way kind of in a born again kind of mode. I might be down the track, who knows? But it's certainly broken open this window of curiosity and possibility as far as I don't know. And I'm so happy
Wow.
not knowing. Um, and as you said, like I feel
Mm.
like in some ways it's hardened me in a good way. It has strengthened me in some ways where there are just some things that are very clear to me as far as I don't compromise on my boundaries. I don't compromise uh increasingly on like my mental health, my physical health. But also one of the things it did
Mm.
for me, especially after Gran died, I remember sending Carolyn an email saying, I knew I was fully recovered. I knew for sure, but it feels like it's set in kind of stone now. Like if all of this could have happened to me in a 6 month period, because it was loss and it was a bunch of other shit that happened around the same time, like I am not going back. I am not going back. If this didn't rattle me all the way back to relapse and full blown back into an eating disorder,
Mm.
me, I can't think of many
Mm.
more things that could push me back into that canyon, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Yeah.
initially,
Wow.
full
Absolutely.
resentment of grief. And now it feels like it's that foundation that recovery built. I feel like grief has like put another solid layer on that foundation.
I mean, it's kind of like your dad gave you that extra strength to be like, no, you've got this in this world. Like you've got yourself. You can back yourself. I think that feeling of knowing that you can back yourself, it's a superpower. You
Yeah.
know, my grandma died a few years ago now. And when she passed away, I was in a completely different place in my life. I mean, the grief, it never felt unmanageable. Of course, I was incredibly sad. I was, you know, firstborn and favorite grandchild.
Mm.
So we had a special relationship. But comparing that to my pre-recovery grief, worlds apart. Because
Yeah.
like you're saying, like I knew myself this time and I knew how to hold space for the storm. I wasn't trying to swallow it.
Yes.
And I think I was, you never, like we're saying, you're never prepared for it, but I knew that I could back myself. And also because of this, I think it really um impacted my experience and my connection to life, like you're talking about, and how it really, I think it had more of a positive impact in terms of helping me understand how do I want to live this life and what does this life actually mean to me, as opposed to when Kyle passed away, I thought this life sucks.
Yeah.
Like this is what is the point? Kind of like
Yeah.
had that very more pessimistic approach, as opposed to I was able to see like life is a beautiful thing
Yeah.
and love is a beautiful thing. Because I think what you were saying before about sort of, you know, like the physical body is there and then, you know, his essence is gone. I think I feel like people that we love never really leave us.
Yes.
This is just sort of how I've come to understand over the years. Is like you never lose their love because it adds something to you. You know, it seems like we kind of like you know, you are going to go on loving your dad forever.
Yeah.
And I think as long as you're loving them, it means that they've given you something and it's changed you. So they sort of become this like living part of us. And so we'll never lose them. That's kind of just how I have come to understand it over time. Um, but you know, I also think I have such beautiful memories of when my grandma died and like those come the sort of the weeks after it, sort of when all the family comes together. And there's sadness, but there's just so much beauty in it because I think the way in which I could relate to the entire experience was so different. And it really speaks to love. My grandparents had the love story of all love stories.
Mm.
Like it is just so like quintessential Australian small country town. And when we were thinking about doing this podcast, I knew that I had written this Instagram post like back a few years ago when she died.
Mm.
And I'll read it to you because I feel like it literally speaks to this whole conversation about the kind of transition of understanding grief to love.
Yeah.
And it's just short, but I'll say it says, we knew my grandmother as Mimi. She met my grandfather when she was 14 at a dance in the Lavington Community Hall in Albury in 1956. He asked her dad if he could take her out, and he said, no, come back in 4 years. And he did to the day. Death and love have their own way of inhabiting time and their own beautiful, trying patience of coming and going. They both pull us towards presence and humbly and relentlessly show us the vulnerability of simply being human and choosing to care for something that is ultimately out of our control. Now, my granddad listens to cassettes of her recordings of her singing every day. Her voice feels as if it stops time when in actuality, it expands it, illuminating what really When we say yes to love, we open ourselves to the spectrum of life and we get to collect the stories of profound intimacy and the aching heartbreaks of goodbye. This
Mm,
is Mimi, this is love, and love is everywhere. And I just think being able
beautiful.
to have that perspective versus when I was like 20 years old,
Mm,
it gives me such immense gratitude for my healing experience and for my recovery.
yeah.
And I think it just almost like it's the simplest thing ever, right? But this realization of like, there is no time like the present.
Mm,
And the thing that I think needs to be the focus in the present is figuring out how to be mentally well, how to be physically well, how to be emotionally well,
mm.
so that you can show up for yourself in these inevitable times in life. Because, my experience of grief before it happened, naivety, after it, gratitude, I
Yeah.
would say.
Yeah. That's beautiful, Hol. It's beautifully, what a beautiful tribute to your grandparents. That's absolutely gorgeous. And
Mm.
I think you're so right. When I could finally kind of access the grief behind like the wall of fire of trauma, I was like, oh, I do this all day, every day. Like I take the grief process over like the trauma,
Mm.
parasitically jumping onto it all day, every day. Because as much as it's painful to access my dad in
Mm.
some ways, it's also beautiful. Like I was very lucky. I had a dad who thought I was the best thing ever and like told me so and was so fun. He was so part of forming who I am as a person. We've talked about the fact he was a great, big, amazing feminist. He was a creative. He had me
Mm.
writing creatively from when I was like 4 and would read everything and think it was all amazing and wonderful. He was just incredible. He was extraordinary. We talked about politics together. So now when I see things like, what's happening in US politics at the moment, I so desperately want to talk to him
Mm.
about it. But I also know exactly what he'd say. Or when I get stuck on a life decision, or I'm heartbroken, or I'm stressed, or am just
Mm.
questioning things, I know what he would say. Or if I'm not sure of what I should do, I know what he would say. Like that love is infinite. He could only be here to give me 31
Mm.
years, but the love
Mm.
in that 31 years, like, it was too big to contain in that limited time we had together. Like it keeps showing up at all the different stages of my life. And he's so much in what I do, like advocacy and creativity. And, he was an entrepreneur and a businessman. He was always coming up with like new things he wanted to do. And did he finish all of them? No. But I loved it about him because he was just like this excitable little kid all the time. But it's so true what you say, because I put up a little post about him on, the anniversary of his passing. And I got this comment on that post. And it said, this is someone who's never reached out to me before. They said, I hope this isn't too much. I'm definitely going to cry.
Mm.
But I worked with your dad about 8 years ago. He was so incredibly proud of you and spoke about you often. Usually over Tim Tams, he'd bring over to the States in his little rolling suitcase. He didn't know, but I was having some of my own battles with food at the time, and his stories about all the amazing work you're doing was incredibly inspiring. He was a very good man, and I'm sorry for your loss. And like, if someone had left that comment 4 years ago, I would have felt nothing. I would have just, it would have been, just too soon, too much, too painful. And it is painful. Like I'm crying because, of course, I miss him. I would give up anything to have 5 minutes. But it also comes with like this immense warmth. And, when people say like they're with you, when someone's not in that stage yet, it's the worst thing you can say to someone. When they are in the right, that's like you can never really get anything right in terms of like saying the perfect thing to someone who's grieving, because a lot of it is about timing. But I really do feel it, like in the decisions I make and, the direction of my life. He's like this silent advisor who's still there, because, yeah, I try to take him with me, in everything that I do. Um, and there's something just so beautiful about that duality of like the immense sadness and loss, and also the immense love. Like I know that it's oversaid, but it's that great quote, grief is just love with nowhere to go, and you just got to wrap yourself in it.
Mm.
Like if they're not here to say it,
Mm.
if they loved you well and you loved them well, you probably already know what they would say. it would be the I love you and the I'm proud of you that you need. Like, you probably already have a pretty good
Mm,
guess of what they would have to say.
absolutely. That's so beautiful. What a beautiful message to receive at this time.
Yeah.
Um, because I love when you speak about your dad and hearing about stories about him and then really kind of understanding how he has shaped you. I think if nothing else, grief absolutely gives us the reminder of how deeply we are able to feel and how deeply we are able to love. And then I think, I don't know, it kind of it certainly has helped me like wear my heart on my sleeve more, which is maybe a little bit opposite to you. I think it's like, I mean, it doesn't take much to make this girl cry. I saw a nonna drop her ice cream yesterday. I feel like my heart broke into a million pieces.
Can
But
imagine.
it definitely just makes, yeah, definitely just makes me more sensitive to life. And I'm so okay with that. I'm so okay with just crying all the time and being sad about things because I don't know, I think feeling always, and again, something recovery taught me, feeling is always better than not feeling. And just being able, like having the skills to be able to express your emotional world and be able to process and talk about it when you feel ready to,
Yeah.
it's a bit of a game changer, I think.
Yeah. And it's honoring them, like it's
Yeah.
ready. Like it feels like when I cry about him now, whether it's, going over old photos or watching the Skype videos that I recorded and just giving myself, like, not, turning it into self-torture, but just giving myself that chance to spend that time with spending time with my grief feels like spending time with him. It feels like honoring him, as
Mhm.
opposed to just burying it and burying it. Feels like hiding them away somehow. And if you've got to survive by doing that at times or for whatever period of time, but going back to, like, if it feels like that's your constant state of survival, you may be dealing with something a little bit more than just grief. What are, if
Yeah.
any like quotes
Mm.
or maybe skills or books or movies or whatever that spoke to you or speak to you about grief? Because I struggled with this. I for so long felt I couldn't find it.
Mm.
What are
Yeah.
some things that maybe speak to you or spoke to you and like you saw yourself in or helped you to process?
To be honest, I think any of the resources or things that I had through this time were pretty weak. Like again, like you, like I just really feel like I really didn't have anything that really anchored me. But a quote that it's just probably my most favorite quote in the world, and I really look at it in the sense of trying to understand the specialness that someone has in your life and how you kind of create your own subculture with someone is you were there and I was there, and together we created a world. And I think it just speaks to like the simplicity of like having a shared bond with that is intimate with one other person in the world.
Yeah.
And yeah, that's just something that I had with me through when Kyle died. And it kind of helped me understand that no one else it doesn't have to make sense to anyone else.
Yeah.
It made sense to us in our world, and that's actually all that matters. But some books that these are my dark day books. They're
Yeah.
not grief specific, but they definitely changed the way in which I have thought about my suffering.
Yeah.
Is Pema Chodron, When Things Fall Apart. Also, her other book, The Places That Scare You. If you haven't read When Things Fall Apart, you should buy it today. It's very
Yeah.
special. And also Jack Cornfield, A Path with Heart. Both are like pretty spiritual books,
Yeah.
but they were incredibly grounding for me at different, like significant points in my life. In terms of resources, I didn't use this, but there's a beautiful grief journal that I have sent to friends and people who have lost someone in their life that really helps. Like it's like a specific journal for grieving that I think is just beautiful. Maybe we'll put the link in the show notes.
Yeah.
But other than that, I feel like I was kind of writing blind.
I feel the same. Like I would watch every TED talk, I would listen to every podcast that was like specifically geared to grief, and just nothing made me feel um like I could see myself in it. Like it just didn't speak to me until I came across this amazing analogy. And again, I don't think anything that is like a resource for grief, don't make your expectation that it will make it better or make you feel better or make the pain any less. I think it's more about feeling understood and feeling like you can contextualize and maybe give some language to what you're experiencing, because it can just feel so much like you're swimming in just, the fog for so long, which is the concept of the ball in the box, which is if you imagine, your life and grief is like a box, and there's a button on the inner wall of the box, right? It's this little red button. And I'll put up like a graphic and there'll be a link in the description as well. And when somebody first dies, this big ball shows up in the box. and it's like taking up every bit of space, and it's pressing against that button. And what that button is the feelings of grief, the intensity of grief. So when someone first dies, that ball is pushing that button the whole time, right? It's just relentless. And then as life goes on, the box starts to get a bit bigger. So the ball's got a little bit more room to move around, and it's still mostly pressing on the button, but it's spending a little bit of time away from it. So you're getting a little bit of relief. And that box continues to get bigger and bigger and bigger. And the ball, relative to the size of the box, means it's now bouncing around, and it'll sort of hit all the walls, and eventually it's going to hit that button. And when it hits the button, the pain that the button emits is as intense and painful and strong as the day it first got hit, but the frequency of it isn't as constant. And I think that really helped me to like give myself a little bit of a crash mat in terms of my expectation management. This was not going to suddenly not hurt. This isn't something that, like a heartbreak, maybe, that eventually you look back and go, oh God, that guy. Like, you're not going to do that with someone you love who passed away. It's going to be as intense as day one, but it's not going to be day one all the time. So like I said, I'll put the link to a bit of that explanation for people just to keep in their back pocket. And another thing that really helped me was the TV show The Good Place, which is a TV show which is the concept of, what happens when people go to heaven. And there's this beautiful scene towards the end of the series where one of the characters is describing death to the other character they're sitting with. And they're talking about the fact that people are like waves in the ocean. It's kind of like that energy that we were talking about, that when you see it forming a wave that comes out of this great mass of water, it's this one individual wave, and you can see it, and it's got form and it's got shape, and then it crashes on the shore. And it spent the amount of time it spent as a wave for as long as it was supposed to. But then when it recedes back into the water, it's not gone. It's just gone back into the place where it belongs, where it was always going to go back to. And that just helped me kind of, without going to a really religious place, given I'm not religious, it gave me kind of like a Bible passage, which isn't a Bible passage, to describe maybe, where my dad and my grandmother and all the people I've lost, where they've gone to, without having to have any certainty, and just keep open that like curiosity and possibility of them being hopefully somewhere out in the universe where they're supposed to be, where we're all supposed to be at the end of, whatever our journey in time here on the planet is supposed to be.
That resonates so much, that analogy, both of them really, particularly the waves. I mean, how many analogies do we have that use waves as the main event? But I think even just that idea that like the wave then changes, it doesn't go away, it just changes, it becomes part of something bigger. Yeah. Which I think is beautiful. It's so beautiful. And like, I think what you're speaking to is death it is this ultimate form of grounding. Like grief is this form of grounding. And it kind of says to you there is no other moment than this moment.
Yeah.
Right. Like it has this just quality of presence that is like, hey, things have changed. There's no going back. You have to be here right now, and you have to feel this. And I think that is what grief stops you. It pulls you out of your tracks, it's incredibly like it's unpredictable, and it's heavy, and it's harsh, and it's intense, but it is, like we're saying, it's absolutely the experience of being a human being in that moment, the most raw, vulnerable experience of this life.
Yeah. And it's another reason, why I'm so grateful for my recovery, and why I think, I think this is a valuable conversation, whether someone's gone through grief or, as I said, no one's getting out of this life thing without the honor and privilege of loving people, and therefore the honor and privilege of losing them as well. And I went through recovery with this very idealistic view that I'd done all this hard work, and I had, been brought down to the foundation of who I was, and I'd had to rebuild all this stuff. And my reward for that was that nothing bad was ever going to happen again, or if something bad did happen, it wasn't going to affect me that badly. That ain't it. Like, that is not, that is not how any of this works. All it does is it provides you with a framework and a capacity and a trust and knowing of self that things can bring you down to your foundation, and you're going to stand back and look at all the disaster, and when you're ready, you're going to pick up a hammer and you're going to put it all back together again. that you have the knowledge and the awareness of how to help seek, how to speak to yourself productively, how to resource yourself, how to give yourself time, how to have healthy boundaries, how to do all the things that, insert catastrophic personal event here. All of the same stuff kind of applies, right? Which is most importantly, keeping yourself as intact as possible, as adaptively as possible, and being as compassionate with yourself as possible. Couldn't have survived it, I think, without recovery. I think I'd still be here. I don't know I'd be this version of myself had I not already had the parachute of all the work I'd done before to catch me, as I just like felt like I was plummeting at times.
And these are some of the bigger picture things that I think when people are sort of like in the thick of recovery, maybe they're having a day, it's a bit of a teen angst, eating disorder day, and they're like, fuck it, I don't want to do recovery, whatever it is. Oh, excuse my swearing, unnecessary swearing.
We
But
swear all the
this
time.
is
They're not going to be
this is one
surprised.
of but but sometimes it's warranted and sometimes it's unnecessary. But I think when someone's like really in it, like say they're having a really difficult recovery day or week and they're like, I don't want to do this, what's the point? It's like, this is the point.
Yeah.
Because you being able to support yourself in this life matters.
Yes. And then the gift of like, now when I have people who are going through, like I was one of the first people I knew to lose a parent. And now that people are going through it more and more as we get older, it is a gift to be able to kind of be like shine a little bit of a light behind you. Like I may not necessarily know all the steps of what I'm doing next, but I know how I got to where I am, and I can at least like leave a little bit of a light as I
Yeah.
go. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, this is so much of what we talk about, right? Which is the infinite ongoing gift of all this work you're doing. It doesn't have to stop at recovery. They can translate into life rafts, lighthouses, whatever part of the nautical metaphor you want to, whatever that landscape you want to
Yeah.
attach to. Um, it can continue to be these gifts as your life evolves in ways that you can't even conceive of yet. I had no idea how much I think I needed the work I did at 25 more at 31 than I probably needed it when I went through recovery.
Yeah. Wow. I think this conversation has been really important and really special. And I think also just for anyone listening, if this has hit close to home, it's just really important for you to care for yourself, reach out to someone, or even if you feel like this episode would help someone else, send it to them. I think, we are, yeah, I mean, we're recovery coaches, but we're also here to support the experience of life more than anything. I feel like that is really what our job experience is, and this is a big part of it.
That's why I love our intro. It's the messy human bit, right? That's where all the best stuff is. That's where we're
Yeah.
all in this
And
together kind of stuff is. So yeah, I agree. I think,
very messy.
yeah, very human episode. If this is something that you could listen to and you came all the way to the end, thank you so much. Go and do something good and kind and grounding for yourself. I'm going to do that. I'm going to go and stick my face out in the sun on my balcony. And yeah, if anybody is listening and they are in that dark place right now, I'm not going to promise you when it's going to get better, but I am going to tell you there are much lighter days ahead. And that if I heard this coming through my headphones 4 years ago, I would have said, fuck you. No, it's not. That's part of it too, is that this will feel like it's not possible. In terms of like getting some clarity and getting up above the waves and then finally getting your feet on shore and being able to see it all for what it is. So I can't make any promises about when, but if you feel like you need more support, please get it. Please reach out to a therapist, particularly if you think there's some trauma intertwined with this stuff. Do not wait. Trauma only metastasizes, it doesn't stay stagnant. And you deserve to be able to access your grief and honor that person.
Thanks, Mil. Great
Thank
talking
you.
as always.
Oh, as always, enjoy Italy. Keep those stories are coming. And we will see you guys in a couple of weeks. Thanks, Hol.
See you then.